In our study of the life divine, we are reading the chapter titled The Evolution of the Spiritual Man. In the passage we are at, Sri Aurobindo has been describing nature's effort to awaken humanity to its deeper spiritual possibilities, for which she uses 4 distinct entry points. The first is religion, which begins with an initial instinctive, vital sense of the presence of the infinite, the hidden inner reality, and then evolves from there. The second stream is occultism, which turns to deeper powers. While religion builds a relationship with that divinity, builds a relationship to God, personality of the divine, occultism opens to the inner powers and the inner potential within the human being, which also is an aspect of the divine waiting to manifest in us. The third stream, emergent, dwells on the power of thought, developing a spiritual philosophy that allows the mind to understand these things which are otherwise outside its domain of direct experience. And this naturally comes later as the consciousness of humanity settles more in the power of the intellect. The fourth stream is the direct spiritual experience, of which yoga is the largest organized body of knowledge and practice. But all of these 4, we saw, are mutually interdependent and even sometimes indistinguishable from each other, even as they part into specialized development and rejoin. We are in the portion where he describes the development of religion, and religion going through 3 stages. First, more instinctive, almost the level of the animal human sensing deeper realities, building relationships with deeper powers, with the sense of the infinite or divinity behind, within. It then grows into its second stage where the intellect now joins what was earlier a vital intuition. And here we saw the complex interactions, intellect trying to dominate, trying to organize, and then overdoing its domination, and in the process throwing out elements that it cannot understand. And this gives way to a third phase in which the same impulse which was there before, now concentrated, is complemented by an impulse to widen, to spread, to extend the benefits that a few have into all humanity. So in the third stage is this dual principle of nature, concentration and dissemination. And between the two, there is an oscillation, dissemination diluting, concentration giving exclusive but narrow development. And of course, it has to begin with a few, it has to spread to many, with whatever consequence of loss. But in this third phase, we saw how the tendency for dissemination conflicting with the tendency for concentration and retaining purity often leads to divisions within the religion itself, sometimes taking intellectual forms of a rebellious or Protestant reaction against a more pure or Catholic tendency. But as we saw, this need not be so. This hard division is not necessary. Is there a different way for it to happen? And that's the paragraph we are at now. He says, it would have been possible for the evolutionary principle to have preserved its pristine wholeness of movement while pressing on. Now we saw that nature pushing this evolution at many points accepted compromises, accepted conflicts. When, for example, the development of the intellect has to take place. It accepted the contradiction of the intellect with a more vital intuition. It need not have been so. The intellect could have integrated itself with the vital intuition and never feeling a sense of conflict. Or when it wants to develop the principle of expansion, it contradicts or it accepts contradiction and compromise with the principle of purity of concentration. But it need not have. The two could have gone almost in a woven, simultaneous, complementary, mutually constructive and supportive tendency. Could have. And so he says, evolutionary principle, it would have been possible for the evolutionary principle to have preserved its pristine wholeness of movement while pressing on. And how is that? By an expansion and not a disruption of the wiser ancient harmony. So the same harmony could have spread naturally, freely, but there's a condition there. It has to be very plastic, very adaptive. It has to allow for many different streams and sometimes contradictory streaming streams, without making rigid, without putting them in conflict. So it needed as if a different kind of space in which this could take place. So not by disruption of the wiser ancient harmony, to a greater synthesis of the principle of concentration and the principle of diffusion. And for this he turns to the example of what took place in India. In India we have seen there has been a persistence of the original intuition and a total movement of evolutionary nature. So the original intuition with which the whole development of the religion has taken place has undergone many blockages. Each time intellect appears, it puts a block, and the original intuition has to break up. We saw earlier how the impulse or the knowledge of occultism broke away at that point, because intellect could not understand the principles or processes of occult knowledge. It broke away. Even intellect developed its own spiritual philosophy, breaking away from the religion. Every time that there was a block, it had to move around the block. Or when the block was this conflict between concentration and diffusion, the persistence of intuition was lost. It broke, reorganized itself, recovered, and moved, but it was not a continuous persistence. In India, though, the original intuition persisted. It did not experience this block and opposition, and it retained its total movement. Now, it's possible to have a persistence by narrowing, by leaving out certain elements, and you could still persist. But can you persist maintaining all possibilities, all directions? And both of these were achieved. Persistence of the original intuition and total movement of evolutionary nature. How? And now he describes this. He does not give examples in details, because that would again extend it. The paragraph would become an entire chapter. But the words he uses are suggestive and point to and make obvious the kinds of examples which we need only to study history to recognize, or look at the circumstances today to appreciate. But what was necessary to make this possible, he says, for religion in India limited itself by no one creed or dogma. It not only admitted a vast number of different formulations, but contained successfully within itself all the elements that have grown up in the course of the evolution of religion, and refused to ban or excise any. I will read the rest of the sentence. It developed occultism to its utmost limits, accepted spiritual philosophies of all kinds, followed to its highest, deepest, or largest outcome every possible line of spiritual realization, spiritual experience, spiritual self-discipline. Its method has been the method of evolutionary nature herself, to allow all developments, all means of communication and action of the Spirit upon the members, all ways of communion between man and the Supreme or Divine, to follow every possible way of advance to the goal and test it even to its extreme. So this is the big picture. The method of evolutionary nature herself has been the method of the development of religion in India. So what is the method of evolutionary nature? If you look at evolution of biology, take a space such as the ocean, or some special area of land, forest, mountain, desert, you will see wherever there is a possibility of some form of life, nature has pushed to develop it. Wherever that life could, it has developed further specializations. Wherever even a specialization could further specialize, it has done that. And it's as if every crevice, every gap in evolutionary expression has been filled. Why? Because it's possible. And nature wants to fill all possibilities, play with all possibilities. Each of these possibilities, again, if you see the tree of evolution as they draw it from a basic trunk of microcellular organisms, as it branches out into distinct forms, so the way they organize it today, mammals, birds, and other types. Each of these branches further specializing, and interestingly, within each, sometimes elements from another branch are separately developed. Why? Because it's possible. And so she keeps doing this. If the full richness of nature had not been destroyed, as has happened, let's say, in the last 300 or 400 years, you will find every single part of the forest filled with its own specialized ecosystems, specialized creatures who have optimized their life to that particular patch, and yet are in harmony with other patches, and yet are complementary with all other, none ever entering in direct conflict with another. This is nature's way. And if this is her way in biology, it is because it is her way in psychology, and naturally her way in spirit. So when she pushes the religious turn, she tries also to develop all these possibilities. If in the human being or in the human circumstance and society there are barriers and blocks placed, they can oppose or block or break up her diversity. But if there is a space that is plastic enough, this is what she does. So he has described this, and we'll take a few examples of each bird that he points to. Religion in India limited itself by no one creed or dogma. What is the distinction between these? The creed is a belief. A dogma is more like a fundamental principle which defines the religion itself. So in certain religions it will take the form that this book is the word of God. That's dogma, you cannot question it. And once you have assumed this, then there's a whole chain of consequences that follow. And or these are the words that God has given, these are the commands and commandments, or whatever form it took. Or Christ is the only Son of God and He is the only way. Now, having defined that, there's no question of any different perspective. You have locked yourself into a box which allows nothing else, and if it is completely dedicated to its conviction, then it will even work to destroy anything which contradicts or exposes the limitation of this dogma. A creed is something more plastic. It may be a belief that may evolve, that may change. So you may believe that by following such and such practices, you will attain to certain benefits and so on, which might change in time. But dogmas tend to be much more rigid and fixed. Can you allow for two contradictory dogmas to coexist in the same space? It is possible if the society is plastic enough, inclusive enough. It is possible if underlying these specialized dogmas is something else which accepts dogmas but without being bound to them. And this is the key in India. Underlying all these, which came with the Vedic experience, underlying all the dogmas which you may find, is the idea that as many people, so many ways of realizing the divine. Although the divine is one, there are no two. Although the truth is one, each one has his own way of relating to the truth. And so as many people, so many ways. And to each their way is the right way. My way is right for me, but for someone else to follow my way would be wrong, perhaps. And so this underlying idea, which is there at the root, allows for contradictory dogmas to coexist. I may see somebody else following a creed which to me seems alien, incomprehensible, or even wrong, but the person is happy with it, feels himself growing, and I say, wonderful. What is your experience as a result of following that? Well, we will all come towards the same truth eventually, even though we may experience the same truth in different ways, which is again another very important idea, which is as if at the root of this enormous plasticity, that the truth, which is one, cannot be reduced to any form. In the very act of giving it form, you have caught an aspect of it. And in its essence, it is beyond form. And therefore, when you experience the truth or formulate it, necessarily it is one way, but not the whole thing. And someone else may formulate the same truth in a different way, and there need not be any conflict. And so often this takes a very erroneous form in popular language. People will say, oh, all religions are the same. No, that's not true. That's not what this says. Each is different, each is distinct, each has its strengths or weaknesses. Each may, in the end, aim at the same higher truth, or may at least approach the same and stop short, perhaps. But it's not that they are same. And so there is a difference. We have to recognize the distinctions, and then we have to see what are the principles within each which represent its validity or its strength. And then what are complementary principles which it lacks or which are needed now to make it more effective or more complete, and so on. So the idea that there is one essential truth and yet it can be expressed in so many ways, and the fact that each has his own way of approaching that truth, this is as if an underlying foundation that allows different creeds and dogmas to coexist without getting into conflict. So, for religion in India limited itself by no one creed or dogma. It not only admitted a vast number of different formulations, but contained successfully within itself all the elements that have grown up in the course of the evolution of religion, and refused to ban or excise any. So, as religion unfolds, we saw in our earlier part of the study so many different kinds of difficulties. In the first phase, where it is more an instinctive, vital intuition that drives the turn of religion, people develop many different ways of relating to what they sense as an underlying deeper presence. And each of these ways may be allowed its own exploration. As the intellect enters the development of religion, again, there are many different ways in which intellect can integrate with vital intuition. And each of these is allowed its own, including possibilities where the intellect tends to dominate the vital intuition, or other possibilities where vital intuition tends to dominate intellect, or anything in between. Equally, when there is the double movement of concentration and diffusion, many different ways by which a balance could be created, or extremes of specialization, all these are at the same time growing up. Nothing is removed, nothing is said this is wrong, this should be taken out. And there are even systems which go into the extreme by taking things which conventional religion will say is contrary to God, takes you away from the divine, is impure or a deviation or a distortion. And there are paths which say, yes, but through a distortion also one should be able to reach God. Through a contradiction itself one should be able to, because everything is essentially an expression of that. And they are, of course, very adventurous, courageous, not always successful, but the freedom to explore and to experiment is admitted because of this larger foundation. So, admitted a vast number of different formulations because you can formulate the same truth in so many ways. We have the famous story, which, because it takes a vivid example, rams home this idea. 7 wise men who are blind, each approaches the elephant to describe what is the elephant like. One holds the leg and says elephant is like a tree trunk. Another holds the tail and says elephant is like a cord. Someone holds the ear and says elephant is like a fan. Someone holds the trunk and says he's like a pipe. Someone holds the belly and says he's like a big barrel. And they quarrel. So they are called wise, but they are blind. And so the suggestion is profound. In the human emergence into wisdom, the human wisdom still is blind because it does not truly see, it does not truly experience, because the true seeing and experience is not in the human mind but in a supra-mental poise. And it is only when your eyes are opened in the spiritual sight that you see and know the truth in identity that you say, because you are elephant, you say, I have a barrel stomach and I have a trunk nose and I have these fan ears, but I am still elephant beyond all these. And that experience you have in a supra-mental consciousness. The moment you come down into mind, you are blind. Because mind does not truly know, it can only represent and play with symbols and representative ideas. So it's touching an aspect, a form, and considering it to be all. And so this statement is also deeply rooted in the Vedic experience. But the person becomes truly wise when the blindness is removed and the consciousness is illuminated in the higher poise. So, a vast number of different formulations. If you look at the history of commentaries on religious texts, we are told that the maximum number of commentaries on any religious text is on the Bhagavad Gita. Interesting. And it's especially interesting because it allows for such a wide variety of commentaries, because it goes to such essential principles that each one approaching those principles translates into his own mold of life experience and personality and receptivity and current development of understanding, and says, yes, I have got it, and it is so valuable, I want to share it, of course, in their formulation. And each one does his own thing, and people, of course, are drawn to that which most resonates with their need at that moment. And when evolution moves forward, the same text which was helpful 100 years ago may not be helpful in today's condition, or may be re-explained or restated, and commentaries on commentaries get written, and so on. But it allows for this full fluid play. Each one is free to follow. If you contrast this with what happened in Europe, with the church declaring its dogma and its particular creeds, you could not question. The Pope to this day has the right to add a new dogma. And once he passes this order, all the followers have to believe that, and to question that is to go against the church, to become a heretic, and you get thrown out of the whole control system. It does not allow for this wide and multiple diversity. It's something of what you see in current science, something similar. In current science, in its initial impulse, science was freely exploring all possible powers of nature, all possible experiments, all possible attempts. And the test is, does it work? I can provide any theory. The test is in the experiment. And having discovered a principle, you can articulate or explain the principle in many different ways. So initially, and this is the interesting part of the scientific exploration, there are many explanations, many theories for a phenomena, which are again tested, sometimes beyond a point you cannot validate. And so you have to accept a belief. At that point comes the religious content of science, which now reduces to, here is our consensus. That means the majority of scientists now believe that this theory works. The others, though they are good explanations, we choose to not believe them. And that consensus now becomes the creed, which eventually becomes dogma. And so in modern science, you have a lot of creeds, a lot of dogmas, you have a lot of Pope-like authorities who cannot be questioned. Einstein said this, you cannot question. The moment you say Einstein is wrong, well, you are wrong, because he cannot be wrong. And that's strange, because in his own lifetime, Einstein recognizes errors that he made. But also that in his very first papers, there were multiple explanations for the phenomena that he tried to explain. And there were many schools of thought which disagreed with him. The others died out. The school which followed him survived. But they didn't truly die out, because truth cannot die out. It still remains as a fringe school of explanation for many phenomena of physics. Just as a very quick example, because it's something accessible as an example, we are taught in our textbooks that light colors represent frequencies, red being lowest, violet being highest, and each color in between is a frequency, isn't it? It's a well-known thing. That's your creed, that's what you've been taught, and entire philosophy, entire beliefs and experiments are built on this. Explanations of reality. But here's something strange. If you take red light and yellow light and cover or mix them, you get an orange. You get red, green and blue. So red and blue will give you violet, green and red will give you yellow, and green and blue will give you another color. So with the three principal or primary colors, mixing lights creates all colors. Mix all three, you get white. Now here's a practical question. How do three different frequencies mixing together produce white, which theoretically is all frequencies? Red and green combining giving yellow. Does that mean two different frequencies mixing gives a third frequency? Doesn't make sense. In the theory given to you of these fixed frequencies and in the practice of this experiment, you have a complete contradiction. So what would you do? Well, you ignore it. The textbooks ignore it, the scientists ignore it. In practice, that theory with frequencies has no value in the technology of printing. Whereas this theory of mixing of lights has great value. So in fact, this theory, which is Goethe's theory of light and how light is produced by mixing of black and white. All colors are mixing of black and white. There are no other colors. That's his theory. That theory is what is today used in printing press technology. It's used because it works. That other theory of distinct frequencies has zero value in printing technology. It doesn't work. And yet you believe this, you apply this, and the two don't meet. I give this as an example of how it seems as if reason should have put everything in order. We can dismiss religion by saying, oh, contradictory creeds, contradictory dogmas, but it is equally true in science. And yet they coexist, but uncomfortably. We do not say that this is true, that is true, but there are aspects of a single truth. We cannot say that, not in the domain of the theory in science. And yet, from this you would conclude that science is incomplete or erroneous in parts, needs a major overhaul, but nobody will dare do it because there is the church of science with its authorities who now control. You want to publish a paper, it is peer reviewed. These are the, let's say, priests who control what can be believed, what cannot be accepted. And so there's a whole machinery of control of knowledge. And this tendency comes when inside the society there is a certain rigidity of wanting to fix beliefs and impose on all a same idea. But if in society there is an underlying base which is plastic and recognizing a greater truth beyond mental formulation, then one can have this free flow of vast number of different formulations. Because the moment you try to capture reality, there is a theory which works here, there is another theory which works there, but the two theories collide because underlying reality is not reducible to mind and mental theories. It is supra-mental. And so can you have a supra-mental theory? Yes, of course, there are ways to do that, but for that the mind has to be ready to take that one more step. So, every time that you find a gap, someone is allowed to develop their own formulation and fill the gap. But contained successfully within itself all the elements that have grown up in the course of the evolution of religion and refused to ban or excise any. What are these different elements? Well, the element of the occult knowledge, the element of the philosophical content, the element of certain experiences which may not be explainable and yet they are there as experiences. Or there are other elements such as when the religion tries to synthesize different contradictory needs, each of these is allowed to grow and flow. Just as an example of how these different formulations might take place, there is an entire branch of religious traditions, we will say, which focus upon an aspect of the divine. An entire branch which focuses on another aspect of the divine. And maybe a third or a fourth, if one can find them. These broadly fall into, we may say, three categories. One is the Vaishnava, those which turn to the Vishnu aspect. The other is the Shiva, which turn to the Shiva aspect. And the third, we can say broadly, which turn to the goddess, Devi aspect. Within each of these three broad categories are let's say, communities, lineages, beliefs, schools, traditions. So, within the Vishnu aspect, of course, you have many avatars, incarnations of Vishnu. And there will be entire families or traditions aligned to an aspect of Rama or Krishna or Parshurama. And there are some of these are not so popular, but they still exist. And entire groups of people dedicated to that one aspect. So if we take just that aspect of the incarnation of Vishnu as Sri Krishna, within that again you will find further divisions. So there's a whole tradition called Pushti Marg, which concentrates itself only on Krishna as the baby. All other stages of Krishna's development don't matter. He is this child. And the whole focus of devotion of the practitioners is to worship that child form. And you dress him, you feed him, you put him back to sleep and make him do activities, play with him if you like. And the whole thing is of a mother nurturing her child. And in that relationship, through that gateway, through the utter self-giving and the purity of the relationship of love that you have with the child, you have the identification with the divine. Why is the focus on the child? That is the most pure of human love relations. At least that's the immediate experience we have. There is a very different tradition now, a more modern perhaps, but it's equivalent in ancient traditions also, of the ISKCON tradition. And Prabhu Chaitanya and his lineages, many lineages, ISKCON being one of the modern lineages, where the entire focus is Krishna during his play with the gopis in Vrindavan. Not the baby in the cradle, but during that play aspect only. And nothing after. And just that one aspect is taken up, and we devotees are Radha or the gopis. And we love Sri Krishna as our beloved. And in that passion of the love is the most intense and complete immersion. It may not have the purity of the relationship with the child Krishna, but it has the fullness of the passion and the total merging, which we see in the example of Radha or others who were, let's say, manifestations or incarnations of that line of experience. When even you find in relatively recent times, a few hundred years ago, you have Mirabai, who is as if an incarnation of that Radha aspect. The end of her life is when, singing the name of Krishna, she moves to the idol that she worships and merges. There is no description of her physical death. There is no body left. She merges completely and is lost in that identification. And that becomes almost the epitome of this relationship, where the heart is given entirely with whatever passions and confusions that may follow in the human experience of love to the beloved. All these are raised and purified in that special relationship. And then you will find, separate from all these is the relationship to Sri Krishna, when those who study the Bhagavad Gita turn to him as the teacher. He is now the guru, he is not the beloved. You cannot mix that relationship, that is inferior. The guru, he is the Lord himself, teaching you, explaining everything, revealing how to live life, revealing the whole knowledge. And in that is the exclusive focus. All other aspects fade away. And so in each of these specialized traditions, you will find further specializations, further lineages, and sometimes a lineage comes, fades out, another comes to fill the gap that is now left, as if rebuilding it in new terms, in a new vocabulary. And the fact that each of these lineages has followers today, even in the thousands and millions, shows that they still fill a human need. That every time there was a human need that was not filled by an existing tradition, someone came to fill that and expressed a new formulation, a new relationship, and those who needed that gathered around to drink from that, to quench their thirst, so to say. So a vast number of formulations and all the elements that have grown up in the course of the evolution of religion are still there, at the same time contained in this larger movement. So contained successfully without banning or excising. And there's something to be learnt in this. Why is this important? It's not just a historical development. It's not just that nature wants to develop all these in humanity. It is that within us all these different elements exist. And he will come to this later on. Everything that is out there in the different needs within the totality of humanity is also within us as a part of our nature. And so every tradition, every lineage, every specialized form and formulation, you will find resonates with a certain part in you. And if within you that part is large, that part is strong, you will tend to be attracted to those formulations, or to those aspects of the divine. I just gave examples from the Vishnu tradition. You could equally find similar things in the Shiva tradition, and again broad schools, traditions within that, and within those specializations on certain aspects of Shiva, or certain events which represent an aspect of Shiva. So there is, for example, the poise that Shiva takes when he dances out the Tandava. And the Tandava dance is the dance of creation. It is the dance of destruction. It is the dance of recreation as it destroys. Effectively, the dance of transformation. And you see, in that dance, you can see creation, you can see destruction, you can see transformation, or you can see the sustaining of the universe, because it is his dance, which is the whirling of the atoms, that sustains the universe. Now pick any of these aspects and you'll find a lineage, a specialized tradition, a school that builds around and worships that or concentrates on that. as they link to the divine. And each has its advantages. And that's just one particular incident in the story. And you can pick other incidents. There is that incident where Kali is dancing in a frenzy, and to calm her down, Shiva offers his chest. And when she steps on him, she realizes her Lord and stops. Now, it's an incident narrated in a story. But you freeze that moment and you have a profound insight. Shiva is that foundation of the divine consciousness supporting the full play of nature. And nature is mechanical until she awakens to her Lord, that she is expressing Him, sustained by Him, and then she becomes conscious. She wakes up, so to say. Each incident can be seen as a gateway to an insight or a process or a method of practice or a way of relating to the divine. And each somehow develops its own groups and traditions. Refused to ban or excise any. Then there are certain specialized aspects of the development of religion. We saw occultism, spiritual philosophy, etc. So these he refers to. It developed occultism to its utmost limits, accepted spiritual philosophies of all kinds. And the fourth was experiences. So followed to its highest, deepest or largest outcome every possible line of spiritual realization, spiritual experience, spiritual self-discipline. So we can take a few examples of each of these. So occultism, he just says, developed occultism to its utmost limits. What are utmost limits of occultism? In occultism, it's a whole domain of exploration of our inner powers, but also our relationship in the inner parts with the equivalent layers of the cosmos, so often opening to the vital or the mental domains, and especially with the vital, which are nearer, closer to the physical world. So there are two dimensions to the occult. One is the opening out to access these powers in nature, and the other is going inward to awaken those powers within us and exercising them. And these two broad categories then go into further subdivisions. In occultism, for example, which deals with the outer powers in nature, there is a whole hierarchy of gradations of powers in nature which are accessed through various means. From the lowest, which may be of an almost demonic type of the lower vital worlds, to the highest of the higher mental domains. And for each, there is a practice or process of entering in relation commensurate or matching the quality of consciousness that you access. So in the lowest demonic types of communication, there may be powers which are propitiated through offerings of animal sacrifice and such things, where the blood offers a substance which allows the lower vital entities to feed on, but also to gain access to material energies, by which they can intervene in physical processes. So people who do these practices often have very good control of physical results. And these are the beings who will often provide materializations, dematerializations, and such services. But once you look at what's happening behind the scenes, it is quite repulsive. They are the ones also who do basic low-level mind reading. They access people's thoughts or emotions or attack people on low levels. And that whole domain is what we call black magic. Black because it deals with lower beings, but black primarily because its primary utility is to harm, not really grow. Primary utility is to satisfy low-level desires, not growth of consciousness. And the principle, though, is the same in higher levels. But the grade of consciousness being different, what you provide there as an offering is of a higher order. Here you offered, let's say, blood or some very crude element of physical energies. In the higher you offer your love, your devotion. It becomes completely different in terms of content. So there are equally magicians who have built relationships with beings of the higher vital world or mental worlds. And those practices can be very demanding because they match that grade. So in the higher vital, there may be a demanding practice. You have to do this so many times, and it's a strenuous exercise. Make certain offerings, go through certain rituals, and after a certain number of days or times that you have done it, you will have the deity appears to you and grants you a boon. And you then ask for a particular power that the deity offers. For example, there are certain higher vital beings. They have they have names, sometimes very clear, distinct personalities and prayers associated. So one of them, for example, offers you the vision of the future or access to a vision of things happening anywhere in the world. And so the person, once granted this boon, effectively develops a relationship with the vital power who now, interferes with their life, gives them access to a vision, so to say, projects the images in their consciousness, but in return for something else. And being a vital being, they're necessarily desire-based beings, whether lower or higher. And when you align with them, their desires tend to fill you. They find access in material world for their ends and so on. Often they will lead to great movements, great popularity, and people come for the miracles or the powers expressed. The person looks at your face and tells you what happened to you or tells you what will happen to you. Oh wow, he must be very great spiritually. No, nothing to do with spirituality. It is just an occult power. Does the person actually know what will happen to you? No. Often they are repeating what is told to them or shown to them. They don't see. They are just transcribers. You see how silly it is? You know nothing. You are only transcribing what someone else tells you. You are just typing out someone else's dictation. Of course, you get the fame if that is what you sought, or the money which comes with it if that's what you sought. But from a spiritual perspective, what's the value? Zero. Even it's a loss. It's a digression from developing your spiritual possibility, because now you're stuck with an energy in between. So all these exist, in fact, in current occult knowledge. And then there's a whole occult dimension which opens to the spiritual. There, the worship is of the Divine Mother. One of the most common ones known today is the tradition of the Sri Yantra. That is the symbol physically representing the Divine Mother in her creative aspect. And worship of the Sri Yantra is the primary means. And the person goes through certain very complex rituals of puja. The rituals themselves are very symbolic of spiritual processes or relationships, offering certain things in a particular sequence which represent parts of your consciousness and so on. And at the end of the ritual, there is a very strong charge, a spiritual charge that is built up. The person is uplifted, filled with even a light and sometimes with a knowledge or a power which comes with that invocation. And they feel lifted, they feel grown, and there is a spiritual change that may take place. All of these still have an outward turn. And then there are occult practices which have an inward turn, which concentrate on opening chakras, concentrate on use of certain mantras to activate certain energy potentials within the chakras. So there's a whole complex science. If you look at a particular process, you may not have the full picture of the science. It's just a process. Do this and this will be the gain. When you read the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, there's an entire section which deals with occult powers. Now you'll see Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, which is a text of spiritual development, and a section on occult powers. So in practice today, when people study the Yoga Sutras, they just ignore that one. Or they gloss over it. Oh yeah, this is what is possible if you do this. But nobody really enters because it seems like it might be dangerous, or it might deflect you from your spiritual objective. So, for example, he will say, concentrating on such and such a center within you, repeating such a name or visualizing this will lead to the awakening of such and such power. Concentrating on the forehead center will lead to vision of time across time and things like that. Another center will open you to the ability to make your body light, to be free of gravitation, and so on. Why is that part of the yoga? Well, it is an aspect of powers within us. which need to be awakened in the full emergence of the divinity that we are within already. So what's wrong with that, if you see it in that way? The only problem is, in the awakening of those powers, your central awareness, consciousness may not have changed. I am still the same greedy, egocentric person, now activating a power of an inner potential, and naturally, who seizes the power? My ego. Who exercises the power? The ego. So in the natural sequence of the spiritual development, one avoids these. And when the consciousness is sufficiently liberated from the ego, as a consequence of the liberation, because you live in a universal consciousness, the access to that kind of knowledge or the exercise of that power becomes almost automatic and spontaneous, and without necessarily an occult process to attain to it. But in the sequence, therefore, those things are kept later, if at all. And having reached that state of consciousness, you may not be particularly interested in those powers in any case. For what? We have something far more complete. So there may even be a neglect of the occult dimension. But in the knowledge itself and the practices of the occult knowledge, you see all this exists. When this knowledge is passed on, what would you find worth passing on? I had occasion many years ago to meet an astrologer in Bangalore. His father, I was told, was extraordinary, and the story was this, the measure of his extraordinariness was this, that you would go to him and he would say, write your 3 questions on 3 slips of paper. Don't tell me what you write. And once you have written it, he will concentrate and then he will tell you, your question 1 is this, and then he will give you a reading from the chart, which is an answer to your question. Then he will say, your question 2 is this, he'll read from the chart and give you the answer, and so on. So people are, of course, enormously impressed. Obviously, he's a great astrologer because you can even read the question in the paper with the chart. No, it has nothing to do with the chart. It is a mind reading skill acquired through one of these occult processes. What was interesting was his son took over after him after he passed on. So I asked his son, did your father teach you this method? He said no, he refused to teach it. You can ask yourself why. Obviously, it involved some sacrifice, some loss, which the man realized, having got to it, he realized that it was not worth it. It was better his son didn't have that, whatever agreement was made with the spirit, which gave him that mind-reading skill, let's say. So, in practice, what survives over time is always that which has lasting value. And so, you will find throughout the ages, many kinds of occult practices have emerged, been developed, they die out. The lower types die out, or they survive in very narrow little pockets, satisfying crude desires and needs where people live by those standards. But there is something larger, and if that larger thing is there dominating in the overall culture, against that this seems so petty, it fades away in time. And this is what he will point to shortly. So it developed occultism to its utmost limits. How far can this go? How far can you exercise your power? And there are extraordinary stories. One of the great occultists of Orissa, still celebrated, his name is Achyutananda. He was a drunkard and doing all kinds of crazy things. And one day, in his drunken state, the king said to him that, well, what day is it today? It looks like it's the new moon. And so Achyutananda says, yes, it's new moon. And then the king laughs at him and says, see, I proved you wrong. You're not a great man. Today is a full moon day. And Achyutananda, in his great power and ego, declares, well, if I have said it is new moon, I will make sure it is new moon. And then he lays out a pan of water, pours water in a pan, and arranges it so he sees the reflection of the moon in the pan of water. And then he does something to seize the reflection, and the moon is gone from the sky. or not seen. And says, see, I've got you the new moon. I said it is new moon, I'll make sure it is new moon. So it is an example which has passed down through history as a story of his power. But whatever he did had an enormous impact, because the entire court with the kings could not see the moon. It all became dark, just like that. So an extraordinary power. And then what? Of course, he doesn't pass it on. There's nobody else. The thing goes with him, whatever the knowledge behind. Of course, much of it was held back because of potential for misuse. Precisely the examples show you how easy it is to misuse. But to push occultism to its greatest possibilities. And many of these texts still survive, which offer you very simple formulae. There's a famous thing called the Lal Kitab, Red Book. It's called the Red Book. And it's just got a list of formulas. If you want to satisfy this desire, this is what you do. For this desire, that's what you do. And a lot of people still follow that to satisfy desires. But that's petty occultism. This was the grand type. But all this pushed to its limits. And so that is the second thing. Third was accepted spiritual philosophies of all kinds. We find in texts going back 1,000 years and more, descriptions of large categories of schools of philosophy. Sometimes they speak of 12 schools of philosophy, sometimes 15 schools of philosophy. Today, what is more generally accepted is 6 broad schools of philosophy. Among them, they can be completely different. They have completely different starting points, different conclusions. And the most material of them, of the school of philosophy of Charvaka, says that all these things, spirituality and other realities, are fantasies. There's no way you can validate them. The only thing you can validate is your sensory experience. So, conclusion, eat, drink and make merry. I'm saying it in my own words. Eat, drink and make merry, because you don't know what will happen after you die. And it's a school of philosophy, accepted as a principle by which you can live your life. And you can see, for a certain type of human consciousness, that's what they live by. But if you truly want to live by this philosophy, then these are the consequences which also you must follow. So it develops the whole consequence of the philosophy. What should you do then? Then of course there are responsibilities which come even as you enjoy life without thinking of what happens after death. So all that is developed. On the other extreme, there are entire philosophies which say all this is essentially one divine, which can never be two. And then there are specialized schools which will say, well, the world being born of the one divine can never go back to unity. There will always be two. There can never be total immersion. You may realize the divine consciousness, but you'll always be a separate being experiencing divine consciousness. You can never merge entirely in the divine. Now it seems to be contradictory. One says everything goes back into the same one because it can never be truly separate. The other says it is always separate. You can go back to the same experience but never be truly one. And then there are variations to these schools. And then there is a whole philosophy, Sankhya, which is much more, the very name Sankhya says numerization or measurement. And the whole thing is built on how do you perceive reality? How do you measure reality? How do you describe what is the world by process of measuring? And it's the closest to current science, by the way, because that's what science does. It tries to measure what you observe and then through measurement describe what is reality. But those other philosophies say you cannot reduce to measure what is infinite and indivisible. This philosophy says only what you measure is what is your experience, because your experience is a measure of that. You may call it infinite, but that has no meaning. What has meaning is your measure and experience of it. And you can see it corresponds to a certain plane of consciousness, to the intellect which is observing detached a reality that is beyond its experience. Well, measurement is your reality. But to one who has entered an intuitive consciousness and is able to experience at least or glimpse the reality in its origins, then the experience of oneness is your reality. So each of these philosophies takes a standpoint from which it looks at reality and then develops the full consequence of that standpoint. And that's why the word for these philosophies is Darshana. The same word we use here, darshan, as a seeing the divine, seeing reality, ways of seeing the reality. They are not intellectual speculations. That's why they are spiritual philosophies. They emerge from an experience, a perception, a darshana of the reality of the divine. So, accepted spiritual philosophies of all kinds. If you put a man who follows Charvaka philosophy of eat, drink and make merry, and he even says you can make all the debts you can, just borrow the money, spend it, don't worry what happens after you die. And the other side that says you have to be conscious of the consequences of your actions. And there'll be other philosophies that focus on the karmic consequences, because everything is interlinked. Every thought, every feeling, every action, even unspoken words, unexpressed actions have ripples of consequences which come back to you because we are all interconnected. And so the whole perspective changes there. All these coexisting. What does collective society do in the face of such different spiritual philosophies? Remember the underlying idea that each has his own way. The truth transcends formulations. And so each one says, well, I am drawn to this. And so he goes to study, to draw nourishment from that which resonates most deeply. And perhaps having gone through it, he says, well, I have reached the best that this can offer, but I am still dissatisfied. I now go to another teacher and fill that which I lack, and so on. This is what happened with the Buddha. When he set out to find his solution, and the most direct solution to be free of suffering, he went to various teachers, studied under each. And with each he attained to whatever they could give, the best, and he said, I am still dissatisfied. And he went on, and having exhausted all the best of his time, he says, well, I have to find my solution because no one seems to have what I want. And he goes into his plunging of so many years of meditation, which leads him to the experience of the nirvana, which now he expresses as his darshana. This is my experience, this is the way you can be free of all suffering. What happens then is, between these schools, it's not a competition, but there is a turn to meeting. You don't say, okay, you believe what you like, but just don't interact with me. Let's interact, let's test out. So you go through a kind of a debate. Of course, you see inherently to this process is the weakness of debate itself, where you have to go by logic. You've assumed that the truth is beyond logic, now articulated in logical systems, and now you're testing systems against each other through debate. So in time you find these schools undergoing changes through these debates. When the Buddhist experience was so powerful, and especially because it came, his action and his teaching came from that experience of the transcendence, it was so powerful that it overwhelmed existing schools of knowledge, almost extinguished. It seemed as if the whole of India would turn towards Buddhism, and in the process rejecting the Veda and the more complete knowledge which was before, which by then had been obviously much reduced. And so comes Shankaracharya as a vibhuti, as an emanation of the divine, to correct this. And he enters in debate with Buddhism and literally drives it out of India. Sri Aurobindo uses this phrase, drives out Buddhism from India, and brings back the Vedic tradition. But in the process, Sri Aurobindo says he became half a Buddhist. In order to defeat Buddhism, he had to accept its basic premise that the world is a domain of suffering. But his solution of suffering was to recognize that the world is illusion, and therefore the suffering is part of the illusion. But in the process, the gap appears between divine and world. And so subsequently there are other schools, Madhvacharya and others, who come to reintegrate the source and the manifestation and so on. But all these, you see, they have a very rich interaction, none declaring the other as banned or excised, but each testing, debating, and finding their own satisfaction. Now, if you take this big picture related to what's happening within us, consider each of these philosophies or darshanas or lineages corresponding to a need within us, a part of our consciousness. You notice the complexity of struggle in us. My mind questions this. My heart feels that. Some other part needs something which I know is not good for me, and yet I cannot do without, at least as long as that need is there. And there's so many different impulses pulling in different directions. And it's as if all this is represented outside in the complexity of humanity. And naturally, therefore, if you had to evolve most rapidly, a rich space where all these different satisfactions are available would be helpful. You could move from one to another as a bee, drawing the nectar, satisfying those parts, and growing through this very rich space until you come into a maturity and integration of your own personality, where something emerges which is central that can then gently turn all the different parts of your nature towards a one-pointed focus. And that's pretty much our journey in earlier lives, where we have been through many of these different lineages or schools or spaces in different parts of the world, drawing what that space could give for our then evolution. But still, each time you take births, you are as if starting afresh, at least in your personality. And although there are things we bring from the past, we still need to deal with these different contradictory parts within us. And so for many, the awakening to the spiritual life involves first an attraction to one particular lineage or tradition where you feel satisfaction, and then a sense of something missing, moving to the next and a third, until eventually either you develop your own synthesis of these different aspects, or you come into a path which is inherently synthetic and gives you the full, the large umbrella within which all the different aspects can then be freely taken up. So what you see here is what happens in an individual is what reflects also in the society or in humanity. So it accepted spiritual philosophies of all kinds, and then last is the drive of the direct experience. And in this he puts it in 3 terms. Followed to its highest, deepest or largest outcome every possible line of spiritual realization, spiritual experience, spiritual discipline. Realization, experience and discipline. And you will see they represent basically 3 degrees of spiritual practice. In each of these spiritual practice, the effort is to go to the highest, deepest or largest outcome. We'll take a few examples. So taking first of all the spiritual realizations, we touched on a few already. The realization of the divine as indivisibly one, oneness underlying it all, and to take that to its highest until you merge in that underlying oneness and can experience undifferentiated the same oneness in everything and everyone and every situation. Can we go all the way to that? Can we enter that and still remain in the body and be functional in life? Can we push that to such a limit that perhaps even we have to let go of the body's functionality and lose the ability to function in life? If that is so required, well, the impulse or the courage or adventurous character of the spiritual experience breaks through even into that. And there have been examples of, both of these extremes. Those who sought to fix it in life and those who sought to immerse to such a degree that nothing was left and even their own physical body was dissolved into that oneness, never to be able to emerge, or so it seems as if. And so a whole philosophy that says once you immerse into that oneness, you can never emerge. And Mother makes a comment about this. She says, yes, in a way that's true, but it's also true that once you have been put out from the oneness for a purpose, you may merge all you want. Within that total immersion, there is still a fine border that distinguishes the fact that, yes, you were put out as a special aspect. And well, all these are open to exploration. And it's interesting that the impulse of nature within the heart of each, at different stages of the spiritual journey, pushed for exploring each of these extremes. There is also the experience of the world as being completely illusory and unreal, and the divine alone real, separate from the world. The world fades away as if a mirage and fades out completely until there is no world at all. And to enter that experience, or to experience in the world and in all objects the full expression or unveiling of the divine Satchidananda. That is the other extreme. And all these became entire schools and philosophies. Then he speaks of, this is of course going to the height. In the height, there is the total immersion into the absolute, which is the character of Buddha's experience in the absolute, shorn of the relatives, denying, rejecting the relatives, at least in one of the lineages. In the other, the relatives are accepted as a secondary aspect of the absolute, which alone is the thing, and so you get variations within the schools. Necessarily, you will find whatever the initial experience, there is a branching out into these other aspects. So this is what he describes by highest, and he says also deepest. It's a whole different category of experience where you go not out of into higher realms of consciousness, but inward into yourself. And what do you experience when you go deeper? You experience, of course, that there are many layers. In each of these, you begin to experience an infinity. You experience connection with the whole universe, and on and on. What is the deepest that you can go to? And there is the experience that going within, eventually you experience the self, which is utterly immortal, unchanging, beyond space, beyond time. If you go to the highest, also you experience Brahman, divinity, beyond space, beyond time, transcending. And if someone has experienced both by very different paths, they may discover that this and that are the same. The self within, that I am beyond space and time, is also Brahman, which is beyond space and time, origin of the universe. And this is an extraordinary discovery. And Sri Aurobindo points to this as one of the greatest discoveries of the ancient rishis, that your self is identical with the self of the universe. It's not similar to, it's not of the same grade, it's not of the same consciousness, it is identical. And he says this has enormous implications for the future of humanity. And of course we can think of what those implications would be. Well, one of them is that when you discover yourself, you are also at this in the self of the universe. You and universe therefore experience a sense of equivalence, if not identity of some kind. But also it means you are as if a miniature universe. Within you, all powers of the universe can now be expressed from the same center from which the universe expresses them. And one of the implications then is you become a co-creator, participant in the divine creation. And this is, of course, the most valuable for the future of humanity. So this inward plunge to the deepest. And then the third aspect of this exploration is largest outcome. So when a certain experience has been had, what are its implications in life? And how far can that go? In the largest outcome, we can also look at the way society is organized. If we recognize human society is a reflection of the divinity, this is one of the sutras from Suktas from the Veda, in the Purusha Sukta, society is described as the body of God, in action, in manifestation. And the body has 4 powers: knowledge, power, harmony, and, action. So head, arms, thighs or abdomen, and feet. So human society, being a representation of God, naturally must have these 4-fold aspects in its working. And so an attempt to organize society to become a fit vehicle for the divine expression. And of course, in the origin, this 4-fold organization was plastic. You found your place, which is the aspect of the 4 that most deeply resonates with you. And you flow to fit that in your role in society. Later, these things tend to harden in time. There's a tendency for hereditary specialization, which leads to rigid structures, which later is described as caste, but which is not a correct description. Because the 4-fold order is 4, whereas what the British enumerated as caste were 2000. So it's a different thing altogether. Lineages or traditions, communities were called castes. But the idea behind it was that there are specialized expressions of the divine, and society is not complete unless it reflects all these specialized aspects. Its organization in the future will be in the recognition that all 4 are within each one of us. And even as we flow in a more specialized aspect or power in our nature, the other 3 need to be developed for us to become perfect as instruments of the divine. So this is an example of large outcome. Entire society reshaped or cast into the mold of a certain experience. Or if you see the Buddhist experience in the Southeast Asian countries, entire society is cast by that experience of Buddhism and living by its values, by its tenets, so deeply reorganized. What is the implication in society or in life of that spiritual experience? How far can it go? All these are explored. So here now we look at the 3 forms. One is spiritual experience, in which the highest, deepest and largest results are seen. And then he speaks of spiritual realizations, of which these 3 are seen, then spiritual experience and spiritual self-discipline. The difference is this: the spiritual realization is something that is lived and never lost. Spiritual experience is something that is had and lost, regained and lost. It's not yet stable, it's not yet established in the whole of your being, and therefore not permanent. So often we have experiences which prepare us for a realization where it becomes permanent. But an experience is enough to change the direction of your life. I once had the experience of, let's say, infinity. Coming out of that experience, and after many years, it leaves its stamp. It changes completely all my values. One of the results it might have, let's say a glimpse of eternity and infinity, one of the changes it would do is I lose my obsession with this current life's priorities. Because I now begin to see or think in terms of the larger movement across lives. And so everything I do, I say, well, what is its value in this larger time or space? And many things tend to lose value. Or, as one person formulated it, he said, every time I have to take a decision, I think of how would I view this decision at the end of my life when I look back. And that's a kind of an absolute perspective for him. And at first when he said that, I found it a little negative, because you're thinking in terms of your death. You're going to die and you look back and you think. I found it a little dark. But I found it has a truth which comes more naturally when the consciousness lives or experiences the touch of eternity, or when there is the influence of the psychic presence that comes forward strongly enough that the sense of eternity or your permanence is already there. then you're not thinking from the perspective of death or that transition, but you're thinking in terms of that longer or eternity of time. What's the value of this in the eternity of time? And many things suddenly lose force. Other things become more precious. You can, for example, spend a long time arranging flowers beautifully and perfectly. And the next day, it's all faded and you have to throw it out. Is it worth it for you to have made that arrangement and spent 5 hours to make the perfect flower arrangement, knowing that in 24 hours it will all be thrown away? And there's a certain type of nature that says, nah, it's not worth it. I would rather carve it in stone where it will last a few thousand years. Another says, but the beauty and that subtlety and the purity of that flower's arrangement and the deep satisfaction that it gives me to manifest that beauty which I feel within me, here now in form, in the flower arrangement. It's already permanent. It is already an eternity expressed in time. And doesn't matter if the flowers are thrown out afterwards, I managed to bring as if a piece of eternity and expressed it in time. Now, in the form, these are two very different positions, but in the spirit, they are the same position. Each is trying to capture and give form to something of eternity. One wants the quality of eternity to be there in the form, another wants the eternity to be there in the consciousness that inhabits the form, and to manifest eternity in the consciousness of the form. That's the only difference. But you can see how the same experience might change the form of life radically for different people, for different types. So an experience even having had, it has all these implications. And you can of course aim for the highest experience, deepest or largest. And the third is discipline, spiritual self-discipline. There are many kinds of disciplines which are recommended in different traditions, and sometimes they are even contradictory. In certain traditions, you have to be a strict celibate. In other traditions, it does not matter, you can be married. But you will still attain to the same spiritual realization. So how is that possible? Well, you realize that it is not the celibacy in itself, but it is what you do with the celibacy. It's the direction, concentration of your energies. And for a particular method which uses the support of the physical energies, celibacy becomes important. For another method which uses a different turn of the heart's love, may not be important. So the form of the practice or self-discipline is not in itself binding for an outcome. But for a particular position taken, for a particular line of approach, it may become important. But taking that to its full extreme, how far can you push it? And we have in the more ascetic types even a kind of a mortification of the body, where a person will stand on one leg or stand with one hand up for a year because he's taken a vow, I will not bring my hand down until I have realized such and such a thing. Now, as a self-discipline, it's a little harsh. You do not see the spirituality in it, but the person does attain to a certain spiritual experience as a result of it. And then eventually he comes down, he brings his arm down, and his arm is half atrophied, and it takes him several months to recover the strength of his muscles and so on. What was it? The particular practice was only a way of fixing his concentration and willpower. You imagine the kind of willpower it takes to maintain your arm held up 24 hours. That willpower now marshaled is turned to a particular focus in concentration to reach that realization. And it's almost as if the body says, okay, I'm so fed up with this pain and suffering that you cast me, I'm not going to come in your way, please reach your result quickly and then take care of me. So it's as if it pulls itself out of the way. And so even in many occult traditions, they have some very harsh training programs, but behind it is the force of willpower, as if you beat the body to remove its opposition to force the willpower now to free and make a breakthrough. From that extreme, to the other extreme of complete indulgence that says, look, it does not matter what you do in life. It is the spirit with which you do it. Focus on the spirit, and you can be having a completely normal life with all the responsibilities that come with it, and you can still attain to that and still be worthy of the responsibilities. And that is, of course, much more difficult in a way, because it's easy to get distracted by your habitual attractions and likes and dislikes. So to one type this is more difficult, to another type that is more difficult. Can you push it to the extremes? And of course all that is accepted. And I give these examples to show that in fact over centuries this kind of free exploration was developed. So its method has been the method of evolutionary nature herself, to allow all developments, all means of communication and action of the spirit upon the members. So what is the method of nature? We have different parts of our being. Each has its own way of relating to the divine. And you have to allow each to have its relationship. The heart yearns for the divine in a different way. The mind turns to the divine in a different way. Your will to action turns in a different way. Or a part of your life energies, which are more expansive, need to expand to meet the divine. Other parts of life energies which are restrictive and protective of your survival and ego need to consolidate to be able to feel secure to relate to the divine. So different parts have different tendencies and different turns of nature, and you cannot force them all to go one way. Each can open to the divine in its own way. And that's how nature works. All means, all developments, all means of communication and action of the spirit upon the members. What are the different ways in which you can relate to the divine? Let's say even from the heart. And you can make a whole list. The divine as your child, the divine as your friend, the divine as your beloved, the divine as your parent, the divine as your teacher, the divine as taskmaster, the divine as tyrant even. Well, why not? All these are possible because we have all these relationships within us. All these are there, and there are even parts in us which need this, however temporarily. And all ways of communion between man and the supreme or divine. One way of communion is through your actions, other ways through your heart's love, another way is through your thoughts, and other ways is through symbols, through offerings, through exchanges, through promises. And you'll find people doing all these different things. When they go to the temple, there are practices where someone will say, if you give me this, then I will give back a coconut in return. If you give me success in my business, then I will do a special puja in which I will offer so many mantras and coconuts. And if you think about it, it's ridiculous. Because what you'll benefit in pure monetary terms is far greater than the coconut you'll offer, but it's a barter. And if your relationship, your nature is a barter nature, and people are like that, then well, your relationship with God of barter is acceptable. If your relationship with God feels, how can I ask something in return? I can only give. Well, that's your way of relating to the divine. But to say that is inferior, this is superior, would be erroneous, because for that person, it's his only way. It's his superior way. Of course, in an absolute sense, full self-giving is a superior way, because the man who starts with barter ends up with self-giving eventually. But all ways of communion between man and the supreme or divine, to follow every possible way of advance to the goal and test it even to its extreme. Every possible way of advance may include, for example, fighting with the divine, opposing the divine. And so we have this story of the two guards of Vishnu who stopped a great rishi from entering. The rishi got upset and cursed them. Too late, having been cursed, he can't take back. And his curse is that you will go to as human beings and live among human beings. You will no more stay as guards for Vishnu. So he cannot take back his curse, but he says, well, I can give you a choice. You can come back by whatever route you choose. And there are two routes. One is you can grow the normal evolutionary way, and through growth attain to the divine and come back to your station as guards of Vishnu. Or you can oppose Vishnu, and then he destroys you and so liberates you from your human existence. And so they choose the shortest way. And they are the two great asuras which are then described in history. But it's interesting that the asura is seen, or the way of the asura is seen as a valid way of attaining to the divine. By his destroying your ego and your separateness, you merge back into him in his oneness. But the evolutionary way is not a merging by destruction of form, but by fulfilling the form, which then becomes a vehicle to manifest. And there are two different routes, and that is also accepted. And so when the tradition can be so broad that even the asura's way is seen as a way to attain to the divine, and there may be people who may choose that also. I don't know how many human beings would want to do that, but the asuras innately would choose that as their way. And test to see how far it goes. In the, let's say, certain spiritual practices which aim at opening the chakras. So there the method is very simple, the logic is simple. What's preventing you from the divine consciousness? These knots, these locks which bind, separate you from your own deeper inner consciousness, and it's what Sri Aurobindo will call the subliminal universal opening. If you break those locks or open those chakras, well, your consciousness is liberated. Now, in this approach, there is no ascension of consciousness. There's only a liberation into the horizontal. How do you open the chakras? By the shortest means possible. And so, again, specialized systems. Some will use psychological means, some will use physical means. And so there's a whole category of practices in the Hatha Yoga tradition which aim at opening the chakras by physical means. They're tested, they're developed, they're perfected. And somebody else using completely psychological means. A third lineage using spiritual means. Where opening of chakra is secondary, the spiritual purification comes first, chakra opening is incidental. But still it's there, as it is in the integral yoga. And each of these is tested. Now at some point I had studied some of these things, and one of the exercises of pranayama involved concentrating with a certain lock of 3 locks of energy, concentrating, visualizing, and with your body hitting the base on the soil as a way of stimulating the awakening of the Kundalini. Now, everything is reduced to a complex interplay of life force flows and physical triggers, prana and anna, physical and vital concentration, and with the mind guiding, and at some point you have a breakthrough. Well, it works for some. For others it works, but maybe eventually after a very long time, when there are other ways which could get it much easier. And so all these are tested. And then with each of the testing, you very quickly, like a scientist, reduce it to what are the types for whom it works. So each of these specialized lineages then describes what is your necessary equipment which makes you compatible to this system. And so there's a prerequisite for following this system or another. Depending on your type, you're accepted or not, or directed to another approach. And that's the benefit of the testing, every possible way of advance to the goal. All stages of spiritual evolution are there in man, and each has to be allowed or provided with its means of approach to the spirit, an approach suited to its capacity, adhikara. So we'll take this up next time, but the idea simply is that within us all this exists, all these approaches exist, and each has to follow his way. And then he shows how even earlier, very primitive forms of early religion or occultism, etc., even survive to this day. But there is this overarching sense of the highest spiritual, rarest, supreme realization against which it is seen and it's valued, given. So it allows for lower gradations even of practices to survive, but with that reference. And that's how you will see even today. You can go to some of the small village temples where the deities are of a very low order. You'll find people religiously offering worship, and still for them it's a way, it's a step of approach of relating to the divine through some inferior grade or representation also. So we'll take up this description on Sunday after next. Next Sunday I will be out of station, and so this will be on 15th of March. We can meditate on this, and particularly the idea that within us all these different parts are there, and each with its own needs. And if it is possible to hold such a rich, embracing and inclusive tradition in humanity, in society, well, we can also be rich and inclusive within our own nature and be, let's say, nurturing of all the different impulses within us, rather than fighting them, beating them down, trying to cut them out or force them into some shape with violence. We recognize what the need of that part is, and gently and very joyously turn it towards the divine. Whatever the need, whatever the demand of any part, it can be turned to the divine without exception, because the divine is in all. And in each aspect, in each power, in each quality. So turn it towards the divine, and there will be its liberation and its eventual transformation. And so we can look at ourselves and the complexity of human nature in a similar way, and much more kindly and lovingly assist our nature's opening and transformation.